Rosina Katharina Kunz, Aunt Caddy, or Aunt Kate as she was best known in Bern, the fourth child and second daughter of John II and Rosina Canuti, immigrated while she was still single at age 22 with the family from Switzerland to Ovid, Idaho. She was baptized and confirmed in 1869 in Switzerland before emigrating. While living in Ovid, she apparently helped her dad and mother with the housework and the dairy. Her history on meeting and being courted by Mr. Balmer is limited, but the record shows that she received her endowment in October 1875 in the Endowment House in Salt Lake City, the same year that her family was moving from Ovid to their new home in Bern, and was married that same day to a Mr. Lawrence Balmer, who was also endowed at that time. She then moved to Malad City, Idaho, Mr. Balmer's hometown. The 1880 census for Malad City shows that Aunt Caddy was still living in Malad as Mrs. L.O. Balmer in 1880, 5 years after their marriage, as a homemaker. While there, she remained strong in the faith and active in the branch, making numerous friends, one of which was James Hunt Chivers. It appears that her marriage to Mr. Balmer ended about 1886 or about 1887, as he was struggling with his own spiritual difficulties. The minutes of a stake priesthood meeting dated November 13, 1887 in the Malad Stake had an entry stating, in a bishop's court, L.A. Balmer reported that he never had a testimony and no longer cared to have his name on the books, so was excommunicated. F.E. Jones, clerk. After her divorce about 1887, Aunt Caddy moved back to Bern, where Uncle David, her brother, and some of his sons built her a cabin. From Uncle George's book, History of Bern, Aunt Caddy spent the rest of her life giving service to family members and others with sickness or having other needs, doing much genealogy and some temple work. She did not limit her service to just family members in Bern, as she spent quite some time with Elizabeth Haney Kuntz, her sister-in-law, Samuel's first wife, and Elizabeth and Samuel's daughter, Clara Miller, at Cedron. Clara and her family, as well as Uncle Samuel's families, lived in Cedron and the surrounding area. The photo shows Aunt Caddy and Elizabeth spinning wool outside the log cabin Elizabeth and Samuel lived in at Cedron. Uncle George continues she was at home unless somebody needed her, and then she could move in and take right over. Some of her service was received by Aunt Lou and then Uncle Orlando. Then she moved into the R.V. Kuntz home north of the Bernward Church House, and then to the Bischoff home. Zina, Christian and Caroline's youngest daughter, describes in her book, The Hills of Bern, her experience and feelings of one of those times that Aunt Caddy moved right in and took over at her father's Christian's request. The year was 1919, and Zina started teaching school in Bern. She was all away for a week at Pocatello, Idaho, to a teacher's institute when Christian and Caroline decided to move to Logan, Utah, closer to the temple. Two of Zina's sisters, Charlotte, who was working as a public school nurse at the Utah State Agricultural College in Logan, and Adeline, who was working as a nurse for Kennecott Copper Mines in Bingham, were influential in that decision, as well as Caroline's brother and sister-in-law, John and Maggie Bueller, who had previously moved from Midway to Logan for the same purpose. John and Maggie had previously bought a home and invited Christian and Caroline to move in with them until Christian and Caroline could find and buy a house. This allowed Christian and Caroline to make the move rather suddenly, as it was the third week in October when Christian asked Aunt Caddy to move into he and Caroline's home and live the rest of the winter with Zina to look after the chickens and keep the pipes from freezing. The sudden move of her parents, thus the sudden loss of her home as she had known it for years, caused Zina to resent Aunt Caddy being there, as if somehow the whole thing was her fault. Zina felt that Aunt Caddy disapproved of everything she did, and was not timid in telling Zina about her disapproval. At this time, Aunt Caddy was 71 years old. Zina describes Aunt Caddy as being tall and bent with years. Her straggly hair, streaked with gray, was drawn into a severe knob on top of her head. She had a large, long nose, and on her brow she had 4 or 5 huge warts in graduated sizes that extended across her forehead. She had long, narrow, pointed ears, and with the bob on top of her head and her long nose and ears made her face appear unusually thin, long, and narrow. Her eyes were gray and small and piercing, and it gave you the feeling that they were boring into you. Her clothing was mostly made of homespun material that she had for years. Her stockings were coarse and heavy, and she wore men's shoes. Zina was not very complimentary as she wrote about her Aunt Caddy. She was continuously doing genealogy and spent many years doing temple work in the Logan Temple. She would stay with her Aunt Rosina Morel while in Logan doing temple work. It was in July of 1904 that Aunt Caddy, at age 56, married and was sealed to a fellow Logan Temple worker, James Hunt Chivers, whom she had known since her stay in Malad City. James died in September of that same year and was buried in Malad, Idaho. Aunt Caddy's Aunt Rosina, where she stayed while in Logan doing temple work, died in 1913, necessitating her finding other accommodations while doing temple work in Logan. Aunt Caddy died in May of 1931 in Bern, Idaho, and was buried in the Bern Cemetery, close to her Aunt Rosina Morel. Johann Gottfried Kunz was the 4th son and 6th child of John II and Rosina Canuti Kunz. He, having spent a lot of time in his youth with his Mormon grandfather John I, was the first son of John II to join the church in 1866 at age 13, being baptized by Ulrich Buehler. There is no written record concerning Godfrey's conversion, but John II's attitude toward Mormonism prior to 1869 is well documented, so I feel it safe to say Uncle G.J. was baptized without his father's blessing. There is no telling exactly when John II found out about Godfrey's baptism, whether before or after the baptism, but for at least 3 years the relationship between Godfrey and his father must have reflected John II's attitude about Mormonism. Godfrey was just 1 month 17 when he and his father's family arrived in Salt Lake City. According to the history compiled by Ezra L., Oliver, Thekla, and Maxine Kuntz Blazer, with a few changes by Paul A. Nielsen, Roberts said, while the family was camped for the evening at Wellsville, 4 of the boys, Christian, Samuel, Godfrey, and David, walked to Providence to see a distant woman relative, a Sister Herzog. It was further than they thought, and being very tired, they stayed all night. It was August, and Mr. Herzog convinced them not to go to Bear Lake that fall, but to wait and go in the spring. He told them that he would go over with them that fall and get house logs out for a house in the spring. Robert continues, Mr. Herzog, Christian, Godfrey, and David had gone over the fall before and got logs out for the 2 rooms. When we got to Ovid in the spring of 1871, Herbert Horsley and J.U. Stuckey came with an axe and a saw to help us build the cabin. They put up a room a day. Father, Samuel, David helped these two men do this work. Why not Christian? He had married Elizabeth Bueller the December prior, and he was no longer living at home. Why not Godfried? He wasn't there. Why not, and where was he? Sometime between helping to get house logs out around Ovid in the fall of 1870 and the family coming to Ovid in the spring of 1871, Godfried had gone to the Midvale, Sandy, South Salt Lake area to work in the mines. Quite likely the Emma Silver mine in Little Cottonwood Canyon that was beginning operations in 1871. How do we know this? Because there are a few comments in several of his brother's recorded histories that tell us that first in Christian's history written by Ida K. Bosch, she says, and I quote, after their marriage in the spring of 1871, Christian and Elizabeth went back to Idaho and lived by Aspen Creek and worked for Charles C. Rich, caring for sheep and feeding cattle. The following year, 1872, he worked in the Cottonwood mines to earn money to secure passage for his brother John to bring his family to America from Switzerland. When Christian went to the Cottonwood mines, Samuel went with him, as the brothers were trying to raise the cash to assist John with his immigration expense. They went to the Cottonwood mines because Godfried was already there. He had been there for close to, if not over, a year. The brothers were communicating about John III's need of financial help. Godfried convinced his brothers that the needed cash could be raised in the mines. That is why the history says Godfried, Christian, and Samuel later helped finance John's trip, Godfried doing the biggest part. Godfried was barely 19, had only been in this country for 2 years. He did go to Bear Lake in the fall of 1870 and helped get house logs out, but he never went to Bear Lake after that, only on an occasional visit. He went to the mines. That is why Godfried, at 19, was able to do the biggest part financially to get John, Magdalena, their family, and Grandma Rosina to America from Switzerland. Godfried was their in at the mines that helped Christian and Samuel get work for the time they needed in 1872. Up until 1874, Godfried was a part of his Kunz family, having what appears to be normal interactions with his folks and other family members, including going up to Ovid to get out house logs and giving financial aid to his brother John's family and his grandmother. After 1874 to 75, all interaction seems to have dried up, and there is virtually no mention of him in anybody's written histories and no history of his own. I have been struggling with why Godfried, who up to this time seemed to have a normal, caring, and helpful relationship with his family, suddenly estranged himself from his family and moved to central Idaho away from his family and virtually discontinued any interaction with any of them for the rest of his life. He literally fled to the wilderness to hide. In her history, titled Williamsburg Remembered, Dorothy Kunz Dairies, from her visits with her Uncle Dan, who was Uncle Johnny's son, said, quote, when he, John III, came from Switzerland, he was married to Magdalena, and she died, and he married Sophie. My father, Uncle Johnny, about 3 years old, he, John III, and his brother Godfried, started out with 2 young ladies, and partway the brother chickened out, and the authorities told my grandfather to marry them both. End quote. Names were inserted to clarify who Dorothy was talking about. Then cousin Paul A. Nielsen sent me an email which contained the following account that he indicated was told to him by some of his uncles. Quote, in the fall of 1874, at the time that John III and Sophie Strawbar went to Salt Lake City to be married in the old endowment house, G.J. went along with his fiancée to also be married. They stopped along the way for a night's stay, perhaps in Smithfield, with Aunt Katharina Kunz Roberts, a sister of John II. And during the night, Uncle G.J. literally disappeared in the proverbial night fog. John III and the two women proceeded to Salt Lake City, and Grandpa married Aunt Sophie on 26th October, exactly 1 week later. After having counseled with Apostle Daniel H. Wells, he then married Magdalena Linder, who had initially planned on marrying Uncle G.J. Once again, no further details whatsoever are known. End quote. For whatever reason still unknown, Godfrey abandoned his fiancée, and it was most likely at this time that he went back to Utah to the mines. Ulrich Bueller, who Godfrey had developed a special relationship with in his youth, had immigrated to Utah in 1872, settling in Midway, Utah, with his family. Midway was settled with about 50% Swiss settlers. The 1880 census shows a John King, who because of birth date, birth location, and other vital information is really our John Godfrey Kunz, whose last name was most likely transcribed incorrectly by census personnel, living in Midway, Utah, still working as a miner. Apparently it was sometime after 1880 that Uncle G.J. left Utah and that he went to central Idaho to the Viola lead mine in Lemhi County, where he spent most of the rest of his life. One can only speculate as to Grandpa's motives for marrying Magdalena Linder a week after he married Sophia Strawbar, but he may have been trying to help right Godfrey's wrong. By marrying Magdalena, he took her into the Kunz family and moved her to Bern. This surely would have created an awkward, uncomfortable situation for Godfrey, and could very well explain his disconnect with his Kunz family. This is the only bit of information we have that might explain his bizarre change of attitude toward his family. Godfrey stayed